Showing on Law Weekly today, we talk to a senior advocate of Nigeria, Fidelis Oditah, on some of the issues that have arisen from the recently concluded presidential and National Assembly elections. We also have the highlights from the launch of a handbook on arbitration and ADR practice in Nigeria, plus our weekly recap of the top trending stories from the courtrooms. Hello and welcome to the program. I am Shola Shieli. After an initial postponement, the Presidential and National Assembly polls finally held on February 23rd. The winners have since been declared, but reactions continue to trail the outcome and the electoral process. The Nigerian Bar Association NBA Elections Working Group, in its first interim report, said that despite the postponement, the elections recorded some noticeable but avoidable lapses associated with the same logistical challenges. These drawbacks, it says, were more manifest in the states of the South-South, Southeast, Southwest and North-Central regions of the country. The NBA Election Working Group also noted that the major complaints of most voters revolve around the performance of the card readers. Some of the complaints include, but are not limited to, inability to authenticate fingerprints or biometrics, inaccurate or false outputs for identified card holders, and non-recognition of certain alphabets associated with some surnames. According to the NBA, the locations where these incidents occurred include some polling units in the FCT, Kano, and Akwa Ibom states. The NBA also reports that despite the late arrival of INEC officials and voting materials, the turnout of voters and their enthusiasm for the elections was largely impressive and satisfactory. On security, the NBA group observed that police personnel posted to voting centers visited by the lawyers generally arrived on time. There were, however, some isolated instances where the absence of the police personnel were observed. In cases where there were infractions of electoral laws or threats of violence or actual violence, it was observed that the police personnel at those polling units stayed aloof and did nothing to prevent or stem those infractions and acts of violence. It was also observed that in some voting centers, the number of police personnel posted there was not commensurate with the large number of registered voters in the centers. Rivers, Lagos and Kogi states were mentioned in this regard. The expectation now is that the electoral body would look into these issues before the next elections. Apart from the national body, some legal practitioners have also been reacting to the process and the outcome of the elections. One of them is the Queen's Counsel and the Senior Advocate of Nigeria, Fidelis Oditah. Prof, let's start with your views on the process of the Presidential and National Assembly elections. What do you make of the process and the outcome?
I think we've just set ourselves too low a standard. The idea that some unforeseen events intervened at 3 a.m. on Saturday morning, necessitating the cancellation of polls that were due to open at 6 a.m. is just not acceptable. This is, come on, this is 2019, not 19th century. So there was absolutely no reason why those difficulties should arise. We had 4 years. We all knew when the elections were going to happen, whether people's goods were impounded at the ports. They ought to have taken every step to ensure that those issues did not arise. So we overcame that and had the elections on the 23rd. And there were issues with the 23rd of February elections, but by and large, their logistics worked for them. They were able to get materials to all the polling units, in some cases late, but at least they got there on the same day and in sufficient time for people to exercise their right to vote.
What about the outcome, especially from the results?
Like all elections, there are victors, and I won't say the others are vanquished. I think it's not a warfare in that sense. But clearly, every election produces some winners and some losers, and we know who the winners are now and who the losers are. But of course, in Nigeria, we also are developing a political culture of not accepting results. There are sometimes good reasons for that, because you see material imperfections in the process, and in some cases, deliberate electoral malpractice. And if you're a loser in those circumstances, you would say they've left you no choice but to complain. So to an extent, you can understand people complaining. I didn't monitor these elections. The initial reports that we saw on telly and on social media indicated that there were pockets of violence and serious electoral offenses like ballot burning and hijacking and overvoting. At the presidential level, it's questionable whether those malpractices were sufficient to affect the outcome, which I simply don't know. But in relation to the House of Representatives and the Senate, where the district is slightly smaller, they could have an impact. If, for example, you had victory by 5 or 10,000 votes and they burned some ballot papers in particular polling units where your support is strong, you'd feel let down. And in some cases, you see these security agents watching. There have been debates about whether they should be there at all, but given the level of development or the lack of development that we have, I think it's almost inevitable that there should be some security presence. There's just a lot of impunity, and people act as if they're animals, and you saw some of them on television destroying electoral materials. Unfortunately for losers in Nigerian election, the Nigerian electoral law is erected in such a way that it's almost impossible to overturn some of them, especially in the presidential election, because you need to prove that the malpractices were sufficiently material to affect the outcome. But where you've got over 200,000 polling units, the challenge of trying to get witnesses in all those within the 30 days or 21 days that you're required to file the election petition is simply too much for most people.
You did say that the Electoral Act appears to work injustice with the challenges and the hurdles it places in the path of the petitioner. How do you think that we can tinker with it?
It's not easy to see what we should actually do, but I think the burden placed on the person challenging an election results are huge and almost insuperable. Yes, in some cases they've succeeded, but if you analyze the cases where there's been success, whether at the level of a state assembly or the House of Reps or the Senate, you almost certainly find a basis for the outcome. If you're trying to challenge a result where someone won by 100,000 votes and someone is said to have lost in the same election by 80,000, so there is a difference of 20,000, it is much easier to demonstrate that there is overvoting of 20,000 than in the case where you've got a victor recording 15 million and then the second person or the loser, the main loser, scoring 11 million. So you need to show that 4 million or 3.9 million votes were improperly counted for that person. It's a tall order. And that's why it's easier to prove electoral fraud or electoral malpractice in relation to the Senate or the House of Reps, especially a state election, say state assembly where you could win by 20 or 30,000 votes. It's very easy to show that the 30,000 were manipulated and that you had 35 or something. But if you're trying to prove that instead of 11 million, you actually have 16 million or you had 14 and that the person who was awarded 15 should have had 12 or 13, you've got to try and prove about 2 to 3 million votes. It's not easy. You have to provide credible evidence with witnesses. And if you take, say, in the case of Maiduguri, Borno and Yobe, and you look at the figures that have been returned, if you aggregate the votes for APC, the votes are not up to 1.5 million out of a 3.9 million margin of victory. So you still have 2.4 million to contend with. So assuming you set aside all those votes, assuming they voted 0 for Buhari, you still have an enormous task of proving that the election did not reflect the true will of the voters. In saying that, I'm not at all saying that there were no malpractices. I'm just pointing out that the electoral laws have placed almost insuperable difficulties or hurdles in the path of successful challenge of a national election like a presidential election.
Any sense in the arguments that some have canvassed that the burden should shift to INEC to show that they've conducted credible elections?
Well, you could do that in a sense, I think, as a matter of allocation of a burden of proof. By legislation, you could certainly say once there's a prima facie complaint, then the burden should shift to INEC. You could achieve that as a matter of legislation. But then, of course, the question is, what is prima facie? The courts in Nigeria have some experience in determining what is a prima facie case. For example, in relation to an injunction. If you're seeking an interlocutory injunction, you need to show that there's a prima facie violation of your rights. Yeah? If you're trying to serve a process abroad on a defendant who lives outside Nigeria, you're supposed to persuade the judge that you have a prima facie case, and that prima facie you fall within the gateways which allow you to serve a process abroad. But the way that the courts have interpreted those gateways is not at all inspiring in terms of confidence. It doesn't appear that some of the judges appreciate what prima facie means. And if you were to import that uncertainty into election law, you require a petitioner first to establish prima facie that there is some irregularity, and once that burden is discharged, you could then leave INEC to prove. I think that that would be a sensible, but you have to define it in terms which are slightly clearer. For example, do they need to show material irregularity? What considerations should be material for this purpose? But those are clearly things that can be articulated.
Election violence and malpractice still very widespread in our elections. You alluded to some of the incidents that we saw on TV, but do you think that the creation of an electoral offences tribunal, or even giving powers to INEC to prosecute cases that some people have made a case for, do you think that would help?
It might do if unbundling would lead to greater efficiency and greater reliability in terms of the electoral outcomes. Then, of course, it will be a desirable reform, because what's the point in having a behemoth when a smaller unit of operation might be more efficient? I'm all for reforms which will improve the electoral process and create more confidence in the electoral process and the outcome. But I think we have to be careful about what we accept as reform. It's the same way that often when there's a problem in Nigeria, people call for legislation. But the problem in Nigeria, as far as I see, is not the absence of a legal framework, or indeed an adequate legal framework. It's a lack of capacity to implement the existing framework.
If you were to set an agenda for the president-elect, President Buhari, what would it be?
I think the most urgent thing that the president needs to do is the economy. He needs to show that he has capacity to address the huge economic challenges that we face. I mean, for a country as big as Nigeria, a developing country, the idea that we're growing at 1.5 or 2% per annum is a complete joke. It shows that he has not been effective in the first 4 years, and he needs to do a lot more. We need to be growing at around 7 to 10%, for goodness sake. How can we be growing at 1.5 or 2%? Those figures are manipulable, and it's easy for us to slide back into recession. So that's the #1 challenge that he's facing. And that's why many people who did not want him to return preferred Atiku, because they thought there was hope that Atiku could reinvigorate the economic forces, and that will produce a vibrant economy. And for a population like ours, which is exploding, we need an economy that is growing faster than that population rise. That's one. Two, he needs to tackle security. I mean, for all the false claims that they've overcome insecurity, the evidence is exactly the contrary. There is some indication, I won't even call it or elevate it to the status of evidence. There's some indication that there is a level of containment of insurgency in the Northeast. But anyone who is following the event in Nigeria knows that they have not contained Boko Haram. They are trying to suppress information as to the success of Boko Haram. So he needs to tackle insurgency and insecurity, and to ensure that the fight against insurgency and insecurity is an honest fight and that public resources are not being wasted in creating Boko Haram millionaires.